live from the campus of historic Cumberland University. This is the 2018 U.S. Senate Debate, presented by the News Channel 5 Network, USA Today Network Tennessee, Nashville Public Television, the League of Women Voters, and Cumberland University. Now please welcome our moderators, News Channel 5's Roy Johnston and the Tennesseans' David Plazas.
And good evening, everyone. Welcome to Cumberland University and the first 2018 Tennessee Senate Debate. Before we begin, we want to briefly explain some of tonight's rules.
Both candidates will be given the chance to answer all questions. The first candidate will get 60 seconds to answer. The second candidate will then have 90 seconds to respond, and then the first candidate will have 30 seconds for a rebuttal. We will alternate which candidate goes first.
The audience has been instructed to remain quiet and not to applaud, except right now when we welcome the candidates, Congressman Marsha Blackburn and former Governor Phil Bredesen. Thank you. Welcome to you both. We have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. We'll begin with our first question, and it goes to you, Congressman Blackburn. What do you think is the single most pressing issue facing Tennesseans, and what will you do as senator to address it?
Thank you so much, and I want to begin by saying thank you to Cumberland University for hosting us, also to the League of Women Voters, the Tennessean, and Channel 5. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk to Tennesseans about the issues that are pressing and so important to them. As I talk to Tennesseans around the state, the number one thing that they talk about is making certain that we keep the jobs and the economy growing as it is. Tax cuts are working in Tennessee, and we hear story after story from people about how very important it is. Now, I know Phil said he would have voted against the tax cuts. He called them crumbs, but I got to tell you, when you are out and about in our communities and you see the economic growth and development, this is what they're talking about. In Scott County last week, they said they're even advertising for people to come in and work because of the jobs growth. This is their number one issue, a healthy economy, good for all Tennesseans.
Thank you. Governor Bredesen.
I think the number one issue for Tennesseans today has got to be the overarching issue of how dysfunctional Washington has become. So many issues that affect Tennesseans economically and in every other way are stalled in many ways because of the lack of ability to Washington to engage with issues. It's become hyper-partisan. It's become almost impossible to actually get things done and move forward. You know, relative to that, this idea that somehow your party affiliation, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, ought to determine everything about how you think about things and how you approach things is one of the things that's crazily wrong with it. You've heard a lot recently in this campaign about me, about how these crazy ideas about how if I'm elected and go to Washington, that suddenly I'm going to turn my back on a whole lifetime of thinking for myself and being independent and suddenly become some kind of a political lackey. That's not going to happen for a bunch of reasons. One of which is that I think a lot of the problem in Washington is with the leadership we have there now. Whether it be Ryan or Pelosi or McConnell or Schumer, they're not doing the job. We need to get new leadership. And I can tell you right now that if I'm elected, and when I'm elected and go to Washington, I am not going to be voting for Chuck Schumer.
All right, and 30-second rebuttal.
Absolutely. Well, I do think that we all know that Phil had a choice. He could have run as a Republican or an independent. Probably didn't want to do that. He's running as a Democrat. So he will be with Chuck Schumer. if he were to go to Washington. But back to Tennesseans, because they want the focus on them, and this campaign really is about them. The number one issue, as I said, a healthy jobs and economy and healthy communities, and then security, making certain that our border is secure so that our communities are secure. And we know he will vote with Chuck Schumer because his vote is already bought and paid for. His campaign is bought and paid for by Chuck Schumer.
Thank you.
This is the next question. It's related to tax cuts. Millions of Americans benefited from President Trump's tax cuts, but those cuts also have contributed to massive increases in the federal deficit. How concerned are you about our national debt, and what measures would you support to cut the deficit? And Governor Bredesen, 60 seconds for you, please.
Sure. Let me say first of all about the tax cuts, that I think the way that was handled is a perfect example of the dysfunction you have in Washington. The idea of tax reform and tax cuts to go with it was a great idea. But what happened when it got to the Congress was the hard part of it, the reform, got put aside, and the easy part of it and the fun part of it, the tax cuts, is what went forward. Nobody objects to a tax cut for the middle class, but you've got to do both sides of that equation to make it work and not drive the deficit up. This particular tax cut program adds $1.5 trillion to the national debt, and it's crazy. There are ways of addressing that. I've talked in this last recently about the idea of just holding spending constant. Don't try to reduce it. Let the revenues grow into that. That would take about 5.5 or 6 years to get it back to zero. It's something which is possible to do if the Congress has got the willingness and to have a little courage and make it happen.
Thank you, Governor. Congressman?
Yes. When you talk about debt and deficit, Phil called Barack Obama a transformational leader. It's important to realize he did transform our nation's debt from 10 trillion to 21 trillion. All of that is way too much. In order to get it under control, 3 things we have to do initially. Number one, a balanced budget amendment, balancing that budget without a tax increase. That is something that I've supported. It is something that we need to do. Number 2, we need to make certain that we have spending reductions. And number 3, we have to continue to grow the economy. We're at 4.1% GDP growth. Jobless claims are at the lowest they have been in nearly 50 years. In Tennessee, our median income is growing faster than any other state in the Southeast, and we are one of the top 5 in the nation. That is good news. Now, also, when it comes to tax cuts and we look at Tennessee, one of the reasons we are attracting jobs and people here, we do not have a state income tax. I led that fight when I was in the state Senate. People around this state joined with me. We defeated that state income tax. That is good for Tennesseans, and it is going to continue to pay for a dividend. Phil said he would have voted against the tax cuts. Chuck Schumer has bought and paid for his campaign. He would vote to take those tax cuts away when he goes to Washington. Thank you.
Governor, 60-second rebuttal.
This issue of balancing the budget, I certainly give the congressman credit for organizing protests around the Capitol when income tax came up, but I'm the one who had to settle down and over the course of 8 years make a whole bunch of difficult decisions to get us through very difficult years. My time as governor embraced the entire Great Recession. We had some very tough budgets in there, had to make some very tough calls and choices. The very first year I was there, we had to cut expenses 9% across the board, except for K through 12. What it takes to keep these things under control is not just talking about it and talking a good game and protesting against somebody, proposing a tax, but the willingness to do the hard work and make the hard choices that I have done in the business world and as mayor and as governor to actually run the government in a way that you don't need these taxes.
Thank you, Governor.
All right, we want to turn now to health care. Recent polls suggest that just more than half of all Americans now support the Affordable Care Act, the highest percentage since the law took effect in 2010. What role should the federal government play in health care, and how will you ensure all Tennesseans have access to affordable health care? Congressman.
Thank you, Rory. And I think that's exactly the right question to ask. How do you make certain that all Tennesseans have access to affordable health care? Because what we have seen happen in Tennessee because of the Affordable Care Act is that you have had 160,000 Tennesseans that can't afford to buy health insurance, and they had to pay the penalty. Now, here is the kicker. And what is so bad with this is that 100,000 of those families had joint household incomes of $50,000 or less. The Affordable Care Act does not work. Now, I know that in Phil's book, Fresh Medicine, he supports a single-payer, government-run health care system. That is where he thinks we need to be moving. We know that when Chuck Schumer and the Democrats try to push that, he would be right there with them, supporting government-run single-payer health care that would run, it would take half of your taxes to pay for that.
Thank you. Governor.
You know, when the Affordable Care Act was first proposed, I was not for it. I criticized it, and the President Obama got very mad at me over that. When it passed and became the law of the land, which it did, I said what we do now is we support it and try to make it work. I think, first of all, this action that's going on of people trying to sort of actively sabotage it by modifying it in ways that make it more difficult to have it work is really unconscionable. I mean, there are 250,000 Tennesseans today who depend on the Affordable Care Act for their insurance. There's almost 11 million nationwide, and an effort to try and undercut that and sabotage it, it makes no sense at all. I mean, it's cruel to the people who were looking at it that way. And the Congressman brags about how she opposed the Affordable Care Act and has voted against it umpteen times. I think it's 60 or 64 times that she talks about. But there's something wrong, and kind of what's wrong with Congress in a microcosm is you're sitting up there, and for the last 16 years, you've had a wonderful health care system fully paid by the federal government, which costs you nothing or very little. And at the meantime, you're voting to take health care away from 250,000 Tennesseans with no idea about how to replace it with something else, and for what are really purely political and partisan reasons. It makes no sense. It's nonsense.
The last question we gave a 60-second rebuttal. We'll give you 60 seconds also, Congressman, on this one.
Wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate that. I think it's important to note that the Affordable Care Act has driven up the cost of health insurance in Tennessee 176%. We have Tennesseans in 16 counties that cannot even buy something that is ACA compliant. So, of course, what would be most beneficial to Tennesseans is to get the Affordable Care Act off the book, to open up the health insurance marketplace, to make certain that we have a cross-state line purchase of health insurance so that individuals can buy a product that suits their needs at a price that they can afford. That is what individuals want. Also, when you look at access to health care, making certain that our rural hospitals and community health centers have access to high-speed internet, that they are going to be able to do telemedicine, that they are going to be able to do digital and remote monitoring so that they have that daily access.
Thank you.
That's a great segue to the next question. The state of Tennessee has the highest rate of rural hospital closings per capita of anywhere in the country. Many blame the state's failure to expand TennCare under the Affordable Care Act. What will you do to ensure rural Tennesseans have access to quality health care? And we'll begin with Governor Bredesen.
It is a real issue. When I've gone around in the state and talked about health care in general, when you get in these rural communities, just simple access has become an enormous problem. Hospitals closing, not the inability to get doctors to locate sometimes in these communities. I think there are several things that you can do. First of all, the future for those rural hospitals is likely to be in some sort of an association with an urban hospital, so they can work together. There are things you do in the reimbursement policies in HHS that make that more or less practical, and you can push people in that direction. And I think really a lot of the future for healthcare in these rural communities is going going to be forming these associations with the larger urban areas of the hospitals to keep the hospitals that they have open, to keep the ability to get doctors into these communities, and and provide the services that people need in these communities to live there and work there.
Thank you, Governor. Congressman?
Yes, I was talking with one of my county mayors, rural mayors, the other day, and his comment was so pointed and so precise. He said, I think during the Obama years, they forgot about those of us in rural America on a host of different issues, and indeed they did. And of course, our state has suffered because of TennCare and the impact there. We were the test case for Hillary Clinton, and Phil gave Hillary $33,400 for her campaign, and they pushed TennCare forward in our state. Now, what we have seen is 9 hospitals close. The 10th one is getting ready to close, is my understanding. From our rural mayors, they say what we need is access to 21st century healthcare concepts. We want to make certain that we have our community health centers, our hospitals, that they have telemedicine, that they have digital imaging, that they have the ability to bring people in to triage our areas where they have lost hospitals. Number one on their list, freestanding emergency rooms, and that is something that we are currently working on so that is going to be available. The other thing that I will add, we have over 200 community health centers in our state. This is a really good program. It helps get health care to these communities.
The rebuttal, Governor?
First of all, I am intimately familiar, more so than I would like to be, with TennCare. Hillary Clinton had nothing to do with its inception. And TennCare actually had some pretty effective programs in helping to keep rural hospitals open. I believe very much that the state should have gone ahead with the Medicaid expansion, and I've talked with people about some ways in which they could have structured that to avoid some of the problems with TennCare. It's a real problem.
Thank you, Governor.
The single biggest healthcare crisis facing Tennessee is the opioid epidemic. What is your plan for fighting opioid abuse at the congressional level? And would you support the legalization of medical marijuana as an alternative to prescription painkillers? Congressman.
And thank you so much for that, because the opioid epidemic is one that affects everybody. I've come at this as a mother and a friend, and have watched so many people suffer. I have a friend right now whose child has an opioid issue, and she said every time the phone rings and she does not recognize the phone number, her heart skips a beat. And that is how this affects so many of our families. What we are doing about this, more resources to local law enforcement. They're on the front line. Right now, they say the #1 issue they're dealing with is fentanyl and heroin. Of course, much of this is coming in from Mexico, and Phil has said he opposes securing that southern border. And Chuck Schumer, who is bought and paid for his campaign, will say, do not vote to secure that southern border. That is where those drugs are coming from.
Thank you. Governor.
This opioid crisis is a real human tragedy in our state, and I've talked to so many people who have lost friends and loved ones and neighbors, at 1,700 people a year at the moment. It's going to be an issue in this campaign because my opponent has been one of the significant enablers of this problem that we have had. When she went to Congress 16 years ago, she started to get very friendly with the big pharmaceutical companies. They asked her, and she passed this stealth bill that basically took much of the enforcement ability that DEA had to deal with these issues, the law enforcement ability, away. You don't have to believe me that this was a problem. 60 Minutes did a whole section on it, specifically calling out the congressman for what she did in this regard. And when you were called out, He said, well, if there's some unintended consequences, we'll fix it. As a year has gone by, no fix has been in place. I can tell you one of the first things I'm going to do when I get there is to file a bill to undo what the congressman did 2.5, 3 years ago here, to give law enforcement the ability to begin fighting this. They are the front lines on some of these illegal drugs, and certainly on some of the many illegal ways in which these opioids are made available to people. It's just way too important an issue to defang law enforcement and its ability to deal with it.
Congressman, 30 seconds.
Yeah, so what he just said is false. The bill was voted on and passed unanimously in both the House and the Senate. It was a 3-year bipartisan process. Indeed, every bill dealing with opioids that is passed in the House and Senate has been a bipartisan piece of legislation. What we do know is that prescribing limits work. We know that law enforcement needs more tools. We need to make certain that there is money for education. So many times I hear from people, if I had only known.
Thank you.
Let's talk trade for a moment. Both of you, to varying degrees, have said you oppose President Trump's tariffs that have hit Tennessee farmers and auto workers hard. What specific programs to help Tennessee workers would you support if this trade war with China continues to escalate? Governor Bredesen.
Okay. This is an important issue, and I think that the best thing to do is to convince the president to sort of back off of this strategy. It is the tariffs we have right now are hurting Tennessee badly. They are a job-killing tax on Tennessee businesses. Walmart is about to put its prices up on a whole range of its products, it's announced, because of the tariffs. That's going to hurt people in Tennessee as well. There are trade issues. We've got issues with China, with intellectual property and difficulties of doing business. They need to be dealt with on a one-on-one surgical basis, not by taking a broadsword or an axe to them. It makes no sense to solve problems with China by slapping tariffs on Canada or something. I've talked to people, especially in the automotive industry in this state. They are worried sick about this, and I frankly trust this information from our companies a lot more than I do what's coming out of Washington.
Thank you, Governor. Congressman?
Yes, thank you. When I talk with our farmers and our producers and our manufacturers, they're all very concerned about this, and rightly so, and all of us are. I am for freedom, free people, and free markets, and I am not a fan of tariffs and never have been. But China has had a trade war on us for decades, and if we're in a trade war, for goodness sakes, let's make sure we win this. Now, I hope that we get these tariffs over and done with, because they are not good for Tennessee. When you talk with soybean farmers, cotton farmers, when you talk with those that are producing pork, they will express their anxiety. One of the things that we've been able to do is to advocate for them and to continue to push so that we move to trade agreements. They want new markets. They want to see the European markets opened up. They are pleased that there is an agreement with Mexico. They want to get this agreement finished with Canada. And they want to know that we are going to be expanding their markets and that they're not going to be shortchanged in these. But we also know that it is Barack Obama and the trade policies of the last few years, or Bill Clinton. Phil called him a world changer, and with NAFTA, he changed the world of a lot of Tennesseans.
Thank you, Congressman.
Because their jobs went to Mexico.
Governor, you have a rebuttal?
These trade policies today are really hurting Tennessee. I just want to emphasize farmers are feeling it, the bourbon industry is feeling it, the automotive industry, which we have spent 30 or 35 years, starting with Lamar Alexander, building up, and we've all invested in over the years, is scared to death of these things. We're an enormously economically powerful nation. We need to use that economic power, but we need to be using it to open up markets to our companies, not closing them off.
Thank you.
All right, speaking of President Trump, can you name one of the president's policies that you support and one that you oppose? We'll begin with you, Congressman.
Yes, thank you for that. I will give you the one that I oppose. I'll give you two. that I have not been in agreement with him on. One is the tariffs, and the other is on spending. Our debt and our deficit, our annual deficit, is too high for me, and I have voted against the spending measures because of that. I agree with him on so much of what he has done with foreign policy, getting ISIS on the run in Syria, fully funding our military. And I tell you, with Fort Campbell, the men and women there that are in uniform, and having lived through President Obama's administration with not enough money to get them the readiness and the skills and the deployment equipment that they needed, and watching that, those men and women in uniform need those needs to be met. Our veterans need those needs to be met.
Thank you. Governor?
Certainly there are things that he's done that I support. I think that the way he's handling North Korea, for example, is different than our previous presidents, but we've had 3 presidents of both parties fail miserably at trying to solve that problem. I'm certainly willing to give him some elbow room in my mind to try something different in doing that. I think his inclinations to really work at trying to find ways to cut back regulations, I probably wouldn't agree all the time with exactly how that works, but the underlying impulse to cut back on those, I think, is really important. I certainly saw as governor in dealing with Washington, we're getting more and more like the EU every year, where everything is very bureaucratic and paperwork based, and we need to move away from that, and I think that'll help restore some vigor to our economy and more vigor to it. In terms of opposing, obviously we've spoken of tariffs, and I certainly think he's wrong. He's wrong there. I'm also really concerned about this, working to drive wedges between us and some of our best and longest-term friends, some of the Western European countries, France and Germany, and Canada and the like, and at the same time cozying up to Russia, which is certainly not our friend. I wish he would flip those around and cozy up to some of our long-term friends and allies, and start being an awful lot tougher on that particular country, which is an enemy of the United States.
Congressman, 30 seconds.
Yes, I would just say this. Phil gave Hillary Clinton $33,400, and she presided over the worst foreign policy that we have ever seen in this nation. Another thing that I agree with President Trump on is draining the swamp and cleaning out Washington, sending power and responsibility back to the people, cutting taxes so that people have more money in their pockets. And one of the things that's really nice, the president listens to people.
Thank you.
On Thursday, we're likely to hear from Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, as well as Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, the woman that says he sexually assaulted her when the two were in high school. Given what you know right now, would you vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh to the High Court? Governor Bredesen.
During the time I was governor, I selected and appointed an awful lot of judges, and based on that experience, what is going on now with this Kavanaugh nomination in Washington on the part of both parties just disgusts me. There's no other word for it. They've taken what is an important and serious obligation under the Constitution of the U.S. Senate and turned it into a circus. We now have 90 or 91 senators who've already announced, before they've even heard all of the testimony as to who they're for. The congressman announced she was for Kavanaugh within minutes of him being appointed, and it's almost as if, like, we don't need any hearings, we don't need any review of this. Let's just go ahead and confirm him. I think we need to listen to everyone, including Dr. Ford, and when that is over, make a decision based on their competence, based on their ethics, based on their temperament, and that's what I intend to do.
Thank you, Governor. Congressman?
Yes, I think every woman who makes an accusation should be heard. And we know that hearing is set for Thursday. We now know that the vote to move Judge Kavanaugh out of committee is going to take place on Friday. If I were in the Senate, I would vote yes to move Judge Kavanaugh forward and to send that vote to the floor. I would vote to confirm him. He is an eminently qualified jurist. He has served well on the federal court, And what we see taking place right now is a PR stunt by the Democrats. It is character assassination, and this is something that is dirty politics at its worst. Now, when Phil was governor, there was an issue where sexual harassment claims doubled 1 year. And your paper wrote about it, David, the AP wrote about it, different people. And what they chose to do was to shred some of the documents so these women's voice would was, well, this is what happens when men and women are in the workplace together. These issues arise, and that is an inappropriate response. And also said that there's nothing here to be covered up. So, Kavanaugh, I would vote for.
Governor?
That is a total mischaracterization of what happened in this. We encouraged, I have a zero tolerance policy and have always had on this. We encourage people to come forward, and I'm glad that the number of reported cases where people came forward increased in that process. The issue that she's referring to was an issue of trying to protect these women so that when they talked to somebody about their experiences, there was not the freedom to put it on the front page of the newspaper the next morning. We're trying to protect people and get them to come forward.
Thank you, Governor.
All right, this next question comes from Elizabeth Ramirez. She is a junior here at Cumberland University. She was born in Mexico and is one of more than 30 so-called dreamers currently enrolled here at this school. She would like to know what you think should happen to young people brought to this country illegally as children. Should they be given some sort of permanent residency or a path to citizenship? We'll begin with Congressman Blackburn.
Thank you. And Elizabeth, thank you for the question and for sending it in. As you know, there has been an offer by the president, and the Democrats, led by Chuck Schumer, said they don't want it, and it would have given a path to legalization for dreamers. And I know that when Phil Bredesen gets to D.C., if he were to go there, he would be voting with Chuck Schumer. There should be a path for legalization for dreamers. At the same time, we need to secure this southern border so that we are making sure we end the inflow of drugs, we end the inflow of gangs and sex traffickers. We also need to do away with sanctuary city policies. We need to make certain that we are ending the visa diversity lottery. We need to make certain that we are ending chain migration, that we are protecting the sovereignty of this nation.
Thank you. Governor Bredesen.
Look, the United States is absolutely entitled, first of all, to secure its borders as a matter of our national security and national policy. I support that fully. We were one of the first states when I was governor to send troops down to the Arizona border to help in that securing. We were, during the time I was there, we reversed a policy that my predecessor, Republican Governor Sundquist, put in place to give driver's licenses to everyone, irrespective of their legal status. These dreamers, though, I think we have a moral obligation to them. They are people who were brought here not of their own choosing. They are in many cases virtually Americans in the sense that they speak the language. This is the home they know. They have no more connection to Mexico or Guatemala or anywhere else than I do. And to have these young people who are at the stage in life when they're starting to try to think about, okay, what do I do for a career, and do I go to college, and what do I do about family and so on, to leave them hanging out there in the way they are now without understanding their status or what the path might be to their permanent residency and eventually citizenship, I just think it's immoral, and we need to get beyond it. I think I blame both parties here. I think both parties need to get together. This issue can be solved in isolation without tying a lot of other things to it. The public broadly supports dealing with this issue. Let's just stop this nonsense in Washington and this hyper-partisanship and dysfunction and get on with the business of solving this problem. We can do it.
Congressman.
Yes, there was bipartisan support in the House on this issue, like on many issues, but the Senate is dysfunctional. and that is the reason that I am running there. Indeed, the DACA solution that I've had, the House has twice passed that. The Senate has not been able to pass that. But back on this issue of the driving certificates, Phil passed legislation that gave 51,000 illegal aliens driving certificates, made our state a magnet for driving certificates for these illegal aliens.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Our next question, following up on that, the White House recently announced that the U.S. would only accept 30,000 refugees next year, the lowest number since 1980. Should the U.S. and the state of Tennessee continue to accept refugees, and if so, under what conditions? Governor Bredesen.
I think that's an area that it is fundamentally a political decision. I think it is something that we're in a decision we're entitled to make, and the president is entitled to make about under what circumstances we affect people and how many people from how many countries come. It's a very different issue than the illegal immigration issue, which is built up over a period of time. I mean, I support the idea that whoever is president can set these standards. I happen to feel like we ought to be more generous to some of these refugees than that, but I certainly respect the right of whoever is president to make those kinds of determinations. We have got to, separate this immigration problem out into the various pieces that it is, and deal with them in an intelligent way. Just lumping them all together as immigration in general gets us nowhere. And this idea of a comprehensive approach, I don't think will go anywhere.
Thank you, Governor. Congressman?
Yes, I thank you so much. The issue with our refugees, I will tell you, I think that Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador Haley are doing a great job when it comes to addressing the issues that we are dealing with, whether it's the UN or whether it is the Department of State. Now, here in Tennessee, we have a close tie with the Kurds. And indeed, the Kurds and those that have come from Kurdistan have a presence in Middle Tennessee. I work closely with them. I actually co-chair, it's a bipartisan co-chair for the Kurdish caucus, and work on the issues that face this community that we have here in Middle Tennessee. When you look at refugees, there is a group of individuals that we need to put at the very top of the list. And this is the men and women who have worked with our U.S. military and with our State Department, serving as interpreters, serving as guides in these regions. Those are the ones that we need to make certain get into the United States and are going to be having our support as they work through coming into our country. They have served us well. They have helped us well. We should be there to help and support them.
Thank you, Congressman. Governor?
I would just add that, Tennessee has for a long time been a warmly welcoming place for refugees from various parts of the world. It's not just recent. It's gone back a long way. Many of the services that we provide were ones that were in part funded or associated with, in some ways, various kinds of federal programs for them. I just want to underline my commitment to make sure that those programs remain in place so that when we do have refugees who come to the state, we have the appropriate tools to help them.
Thank you, Governor.
In the aftermath of recent mass shootings, the debate over gun control has taken center stage in our country. What are your views on gun control, and what specific proposals do you support, Congressman?
Yes. When we talk about gun control in Tennessee, Tennesseans know that we can protect the Second Amendment and continue to protect our people. And they know that taking away gun rights or putting in place gun control is not going to be something that makes our communities safer. And they fully appreciate and realize that. Now, we also know that the Democrats in D.C. are focused on taking away your Second Amendment rights. That is something that is paramount for them. And a vote for Phil Bredesen is a vote for the Democrats, for Chuck Schumer, who has bought and paid for this campaign. And they're going to give you judges like Sonia Sotomayor, who says that she does not think owning a gun is a fundamental right.
Thank you, Governor.
First of all, let me just underline that I am and have been a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. I believe it's an important right of Americans. I grew up in a rural community. I started going hunting when I was 10 years old. My Uncle Arch, I got a .22 for my 16th birthday. I've been a gun owner all of my life. I also believe that one of the ways you preserve these rights is to put reasonable rules in place so that they're exercised in a responsible way. I value our First Amendment rights, but you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And I think there's some sensible things that we can do when it comes to guns, and specifically relating to these school shootings, that make a lot of sense. I mean, first of all, I believe that the background checks are important, and that they should be expanded to include all gun sales at the gun show loophole. And second of all, I think that NICS, that actually does these background checks, needs to be properly funded so they can do the checks and that they can get the information into the database from local law enforcement and other places where it needs to come. And then third of all, I'd like to see some judicial process by which somebody who is clearly not mentally equipped to own one of these weapons can be dealt with and can be forbidden to do that. That would have been a significant factor in 2 of the last 3 school shootings, and could have protected those from those as well.
Thank you, Congressman.
Some of the things that I support is putting the mental health into the NICS system, hardening our schools. And I have supported the School Safety Act. I've supported legislation that would make the red flags on mental health in the NICS system. I am also supported by the NRA. I'm endorsed by the NRA. I have an A rating from the NRA. We each sought the endorsement of the NRA. They rated me an A and endorsed me. Phil got a D rating from the NRA.
Thank you.
Much has been said about the crumbling infrastructure in our country. This includes road and transit systems, airports, electrical grids, and drinking water. Do you think reinvesting in our infrastructure is important? And more important, how do we pay for these improvements? Governor Bredesen.
I do think that infrastructure investment is very important, and certainly during the time that I was governor, saw a number of the issues that exist in terms of decaying infrastructure that really makes a difference. There are parts of our state, Memphis comes to mind immediately, that are very dependent on that infrastructure, things like roads and bridges and rail, and are really suffering from not having an adequate amount of it. The approach that I think it makes the most sense is to do, I guess, what I did when I was mayor and was trying to get money for various projects, which is start to get very specific about the projects. Not I need money for education, but I want to build a school here of this size and here of this size. I really believe that if the Congress could come together and actually put some specific proposals together, you could garner some broad support for putting these things in the budget and getting them paid for, and start to make some really big inroads into the infrastructure problems that we have.
Thank you, Governor. Congressman?
Yes. I can tell you this. In this campaign, I have driven over 50,000 miles around our beautiful and wonderful state, and I will tell you, there is some road work that we need to get done. When Phil was governor, he drained the road fund and used that to pay for other programs in the general fund. And so if you're sitting in traffic a lot of times, this is the reason, because there were not a lot of road funds that were used, and there were not a lot of projects that were started during that period of time. Now, when you talk about the Federal Highway Trust Fund, one of the things that people will tell you is, look, the place to start is getting rid of the waste, fraud, and abuse within these funds, and making certain that what you're going to see is money that comes in for a purpose is actually used for that purpose. Get rid of all of the enhancements, bike paths or walking trails or passive parks. Put that money into roads and bridges. When you talk with our farmers, one of the things they will tell you is they need to know that they are going to have dependable infrastructure for moving their crops, for those that are loggers, that are moving things from the forest to the mills. Thank you.
Governor?
Yeah, when I came in as governor, we had an enormous financial problem that I had to deal with, and I dealt with it by asking every department in state government except for K through 12 education to take a 9% across the board cut. It was extraordinarily painful. We asked the road fund to do that as well. It had always been sacrosanct in the past. They did so. I did what I had to do to solve that particular budget problem. I make no apologies for that. If the Congress would start doing the same thing from time to time, we'd have a better country.
Thank you, Governor.
President Trump often refers to the press as the enemy of the people. Do you agree with that assessment? And secondly, what role do you think a free press should play in society? Congressman.
Thank you for that, Rory. I do not think that the press is the enemy of the people. I will tell you this, I think the First Amendment and a free press is vitally important. One of the things that has captured a lot of attention lately has been what has been happening on social media, and looking at how they are prioritizing, looking at how they are censoring, looking at how they are blocking the ability of individuals when they go into their search engine and do a search, and prioritizing and pushing forward information that is there. Indeed, this last week, you had the CEO of Twitter say to their employees, do not bring your bias to the workplace. Now, in an era when so many people are getting their information online, whether it's through podcasts like you all have started doing, David, then we need to make certain that it is going to be something that is protected.
Thank you. Governor.
Of course, the free press is not the enemy of the people. I think any of us who are in the political world have our good days with the press and our tough days with the press. I very early came in my political career to the realization that they're not your friends, they're not your enemies, they're just doing a different job than yours, and have learned to live, side by side, and worked well with the press over the years. One thing I tried very hard to do as both mayor and governor was to be available, and to be available especially when something was going bad in some way or there was some problem to be dealt with. And I'm proud of that relationship with the press. And when I'm elected, I certainly intend to continue that kind of openness and accessibility. I think we have not yet come to grips with what it means to have a Facebook and a Twitter and Instagram in our world. They are not regulated media companies, as you know, and they carefully guard their independence in that regard. But I think that working together, we can find some sensible ways to make sure that they're not used in the way, for example, they were used by Russia a couple of years ago in the campaign in a way that's inimical to our democracy and our society. But the First Amendment is in many ways the most important one in the Constitution. I support absolutely the right of the press to conduct its business.
Thank you. Congressman.
One of the things that we do know is that in Barack Obama's administration, and Phil and his family gave him over $55,000 for his campaign. His Federal Communications Commission wanted to take control of the internet. The last thing Tennesseans want is to have the federal government in control of their internet. We also know that the Facebook CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, has said Facebook functions more like a government than it does an edge provider.
Thank you.
You're both running to replace Senator Corker, someone who is considered one of the premier foreign policy experts in the Senate. What role do you think the U.S. should play on the world stage? Do you support remaining in NATO and continuing to promote democracy around the world? Governor Bredesen.
I think the United States post-World War II has been I guess, the leading force for a sort of a sensible world order. I want to see us continue to engage with the world. I'm disturbed about, and I spoke a little bit earlier about the way in which the president seems to be backing away from that long-term commitment, which has worked so well in the past. To do that, I think we have to be willing to treat our friends in the proper way. We need to be willing to work out arrangements. I certainly believe we ought to remain in NATO, and you know, this country has been thrust in this position of leadership in the world after World War II. It is an enormous force for good, and we need to continue to fulfill that role in the world as long as we possibly can.
Thank you, Governor. Congressman?
I appreciate the role that Senator Corker has played for our state and also for our nation. When you talk about the United States on the world stage, NATO, of course, is an important group. And I was pleased that the President spent the time to go and participate in that meeting and to engage them in how we work together in a more collaborative way to protect our allies. And see, this is something so important. During the Obama years, they didn't know who was our enemy or who was our ally. They were not treated accordingly or in the same way. I think the clock has messed up, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, Rory?
Believe so. Go ahead.
Okay, I will go ahead and finish it. There are some significant things when you talk about foreign policy. In Tennessee, everything begins with Fort Campbell and their participation in our National Guard, the intel and the cyber units that are now at the 118th in Middle Tennessee. These are critical missions for our nation. You also have to look at what has happened with the work that Secretary Pompeo and President Trump have done. We have been able to get ISIS on the run in Syria. You have to look at the participation of Russia and Iran with Syria, with China, with North Korea. And by the way, I think they're all the new axis of evil. You also realize that President Trump made it very clear he was not going to draw a red line because in Syria, the Russians ran right over that.
Governor?
Finish.
I would just want to affirm and point out that one of the reasons we've been so effective over the years has been the enormous military strength of the United States, and just reaffirm my commitment to our men and women in uniform. During the time I was governor, I was obviously commander-in-chief of the National Guard. We sent troops to the Arizona border, to Iraq, to Afghanistan. I traveled there to meet with them, and I want them to know I'm completely committed to making sure that they have the tools that they need.
Thank you, Governor.
Final question before our closing statements, candidates, and we're just going to have 30 seconds for each of you to respond for time purposes. Name one policy decision you supported or failed to support that you now regret. Congressman.
One policy decision that I supported or failed to support. I probably would have put more energy into across-the-board spending cuts that I propose every single year in Congress, because it's important to cut into that baseline and reduce what the federal government spends. And we want to see that spending level come down. It is immoral for this debt to be passed on to our children and our grandchildren.
Thank you. Governor.
When I was governor, we did a lot of things with education, and one of them was to start focusing on college readiness as the ultimate goal of high school. I think I took that too far and should have focused more on other paths besides college readiness, in terms of making people ready for careers in other fields that did not require that education. If I had it to do over again, I would certainly I would change that.
And now to closing statements. We start with Congressman Blackburn.
Thank you. And the clock says 30 seconds.
Yeah, 2 minutes, please, on the clock.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Is someone resetting?
2 minutes on the clock. Go ahead.
There we go.
Thank you.
All right. I want to say thank you again for hosting us and having us all here this evening. I think that the viewers have had the opportunity to see some differences, some significant differences between Phil and I. I am running to take your Tennessee values to Washington, D.C. Phil has said he is running to end the dry spell for Democrats in Tennessee. He says he thinks that D.C. listens too much to voters. I think D.C. needs to listen more to voters. That's what draining the swamp is about. When it comes to the debt and deficit, making those cuts, spending less, is what we need to do. Chuck Schumer, who has bought and paid for this campaign, he is Chuck Schumer's #1 recruit. Chuck Schumer spends more. When he comes to Phil and says, vote for this to spend more, he'll be there to do it. When it comes to dealing with health care in our rural hospitals, I want patient-centered health care that is going to focus on you. He wants a government-paid system. I want to secure the border, build the wall. He called that political theater. So there are some differences between us. You've heard a little bit about us and where I come from with my background. I grew up on a farm, went to college on a 4-H club scholarship, came to Tennessee. Chuck and I have 2 children, 2 grandchildren. We've worked in Williamson County to make it a great community, served in the state Senate, led that fight against a state income tax, and no, it was not protesters, it was Tennesseans standing up for their right to be state income tax free, and a majority of Tennesseans agree with that. Now I am running for the U.S. Senate to take your values to Washington. I am asking for you to stand with me and asking for your vote.
2 minutes, Governor.
You know, I've come into this, I still have a high school civics view of my country. I think we have a brilliantly designed government. I think our government can be an enormous force for good in our country and protecting its people and its lands. And I have to say, it pains me and so much about with what has happened over the course of the past decade or two, with everything becoming a partisan issue, with the inability to move things forward and get things done. And it's just become a government of people standing on opposite sides of the room and shouting at each other and not making any progress. People certainly are going to have a choice. And if what people want, if what the people of Tennessee want, is more of that sort of hard-nosed partisan politics, take no prisoners, draw lines in the sand, make no compromises, I'm not your guy. And there's another person on the stage here and so on who has been in Washington for the last 16 years and shows it. And is very steeped in that political philosophy, and frankly has gotten very good at it. But if what you want is someone who, you know, brings some experience from the business world, brings some experience from being mayor and governor, and in particular brings an attitude of wanting to start making things happen, of getting things done, of pushing the partisanship down, and trying to find some ways to actually solve problems. That's what I want to do. That's what my whole life has been about. If that's what people want, I would like to represent them in Washington, and I'm applying for the job.
Thank you, Governor.
We want to thank you both for being here and thank our audience members and Cumberland University. For David Plazas, I'm Rory Johnston. Have a good night, everyone. So long.